All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to the real world of procure to pay. I'm Danny Thompson from apexanalytix, and with me today is our resident expert on supplier management technology, Akhilesh Agarwal. And today we're going to do something a little bit different. Rather than spend a lot of time in PowerPoint slides, we're going to show you the system using some demos Akhilesh recorded earlier today. He's going to show you the actual portal and the user experience for you, for your suppliers, and your internal users. And rather than a typical end-to-end demo, Akhilesh is going to focus on how apexportal solved three specific real-world business problems that our clients faced over the last year. I can't wait for him to show you how cool the system works. All right, so those three scenarios are: first, a fire drill that one client faced to address some control gaps. Second is a major increase in supplier risk over the last year and how one company addressed it. And then third, a need to inject cash into the supply chain. Each demo will go like this. I'll present the scenario. Akhilesh will demo the user experience, typically more than one user's experience in the process. And then once we get through all three scenarios at the end, we'll take your questions. And we don't want to miss anything, so don't feel like you have to wait till the very end to raise your questions. As we go along, just use the chat function in WebEx to capture them, the Q&A section. And I can't wait to see what you have to ask about. Okay, so let's get started with the first scenario. As you all know, there's been a huge increase in fraud attempts over the last year. Well, last summer, an AP director called us and said they had a big problem. They've been the victim of a really big fraud, and internal audit was all over them to get the problem solved. In fact, they'd been given a 90-day deadline to fix their problems. And, they were like, how do you solve this in 90 days? Their vendor master management problem was completely manual. It's all based on email exchanges with no audit trail. Where do you begin? So to solve this problem, they needed a solution that could get them up and running fast, that addressed all of their change controls from day one. They needed to lock down the opportunity for fraud, and while they were at it, just address a lot of other compliance controls they had around suppliers, like making sure the supplier isn't a prohibited vendor, or capturing tax documents, and make sure they were enrolled in all their automation programs. They found their answer in apexportal. Working with clients over the last 5 years, Apex has created a fully automated, fully compliant supplier onboarding and master data management solution. We call it supplier registration. And what makes it great is the system comes pre-configured with over 180,000 business rules. And it's integrated with over 650 external data sources and lists out of the box to support every supplier type, to capture every field needed to approve a supplier relationship, and to create fully formed vendor master records in your ERPs. So Akhilesh is going to show you how it works. He'll show you the user experience for 3 users involved in the process: the internal user who requests and invites the supplier to register, the supplier's experience as the portal walks them through the registration process. The supplier's records pre-populated from Apex's database of over 40 million golden supplier records. So the supplier's experience is reviewing and updating rather than entering the data from scratch. And then third, Akhilesh will demonstrate the approver user experience as they review the data controls and validations and give final approval to automatically create the supplier record in the ERP. All right, so don't forget to enter your questions as we go along. And here we go. Akhilesh?
Thank you, Danny. So This is Akhilesh Agarwal, and really glad to be here today and walking through the user scenario. So, as Danny mentioned, we are going to start with the invite supplier option first. There is more than one way to onboard a supplier. There's another way called create supplier, and you'll typically use that option if you're onboarding government vendors, utility vendors, and so on. But for invite supplier, this is what the screen looks like. This screen is typically filled out by an internal person who's interested to onboard a new supplier. So it can be a vendor master team, or it can be users who have the privilege to invite new suppliers in the system. This is a configurable screen. So the fields that you see on the screen can be hidden, can be made required, made optional, or we can add or remove fields from this screen. Typically, an invite screen will include the name of the vendor, the type of supplier based on how your ERP is configured. Then you would go ahead and enter one or more contact information that you are aware of. Only one contact information is required for the invite to go out. So in this case, the primary contact is John Harrison. I'm going to use a Gmail account to simulate how the onboarding process works and the invitation is sent out. On this screen, you're seeing the company codes or the operating units, depending on which ERP you're using, along with the payment terms, payment methods that you want to use for that supplier. So once the invite form is filled out, we can submit it, and it will take us to the My Suppliers page where I can see the status of invited for this new invitation. So this tells me, yes, the supplier has been invited, and as the supplier makes progress, the status will change in real time, indicating to the buyer where in the onboarding process the supplier is currently at. And it gives me a view of all previously registered suppliers, and I can search on them and so on and so forth. Switching the experience, what we want to do now is go to the supplier's mailbox to look for that invitation email. So this is not the client user anymore. This is the supplier checking their mailbox. On this screen, you can see an email from the client with an auto-generated username and password using which the supplier can register themselves and provide additional data points. This email can be completely branded with your logos and marketing messages so that the supplier gets a experience that they're corresponding directly with you. Once the supplier is logged in, a multi-factor authentication gets triggered. So whenever an IP address changes or the device using which the supplier previously logged in changes, whether it's a computer, iPad, mobile device, etc., it will trigger this authentication code without which the supplier cannot log in, right? So this helps protect the supplier's account in our system. Because it was a temporary password that got generated in the initial email, now the supplier is required to change the password before they can move ahead. The password complexity is configurable. The next step is the country of residence. So for GDPR compliance, CCPA, which is the California Privacy Act, and other acts which are coming up worldwide, this agreement allows you to get permission and consent from the supplier's users to make sure you can store their PI data and make use of it in the business transactions. On this screen, you're seeing additional agreements the supplier has to attest that they have read and agree to before they can continue with the registration. The checklist is configurable based on country of the supplier, type of supplier. So it gives them a preview of what's coming and what information is going to be asked. Now, this is where the actual registration process starts. And what you're seeing here on the screen is a lot of fields that are pre-populated. So there are fields that were filled out because the invitation had those fields, like the name of the supplier, the country of the supplier, and so on. But there are additional data points that has been filled out on the screen, like income type or the business entity type. The system already knows it's a non-profit. So how do we know that information? along with our registration module, we have a plugin to another API that we have built homegrown, which is called the Smart VM API. With the Smart VM API, it is able to connect to a database of 40 million suppliers on a global basis, as Danny mentioned before. And using that database, we can match any new invites with the Smart VM database. And once a match is found, we can pre-populate everything that we know about the supplier into the supplier registration form. And this way, the supplier's experiences that they don't have to fill out the form from scratch. As they go about reviewing the form, they can validate, yes, the information is still good. And if they do need to make a change from a relationship perspective with this client, they can make those changes. So that's the context on how we are getting the information from our Smart VM database into the registration portal and how we pre-populate it. Smart VM also comes with more than 650 external validations worldwide, and you'll see some of those getting used in this process. So having said that, I'm going to continue with the demo and show you how the other fields are filled out. So in this demo, you will see contact information. We support multiple contacts from the supplier. You see tax data. We already pre-filled the tax ID of the supplier based on the country they are situated in. SmartVM knows that information. And just to showcase you business rules possibilities, Danny talked about 180,000 business rules that are pre-configured. So some of those you can now see in action. So if I were to change the country of the supplier to United Kingdom, the screen refreshes and now you can see the UK specific VAT number, NI number, SIFNIF fiscal number being requested from the supplier. Similarly, if I change the country of the supplier to say Mexico, then the Mexico specific tax ID information will be requested. So for every single country in the world, we have pre-configured tax rules that come out of box. So you don't have to worry about compliance issues. We got you covered. For the United States and 56 other countries worldwide, we do a tax ID match with the government authorities along with the name match. So for this example, the EIN number got validated through irs.gov, and we know it's a valid tax ID. In addition, we'll populate the DUNS number, the NAICS codes, which is the industry code for the type of products and services the supplier is providing. On the next screen, you can see the registered address that we have again pre-populated based on what we know about the supplier. So at this time, the supplier could continue, or they could hit add and add a second address called a remit address. So in some cases, the supplier may have more than one address. We support it out of box. What you're seeing here now is as the supplier is entering the address on purpose, we are going to use an invalid or an incomplete address for demo purposes. So once the address of the supplier is entered, we leave the city empty and we'll select an incorrect state of California to simulate how the auto correction works. So once we hit OK, the system validation kicks in. And now the supplier is presented with some options on using the Apex auto-corrected validated address based on USPS postal standards, because this is a US address, or they could override it and use their entered address as is in case the supplier is in a remote farmland where USPS is unable to validate. The same type of validation exists for all countries in the world. So that is also available out of box. So once the addresses of the supplier have been captured, we move on to the next screen, which is the country specific tax information. So over here, the system has determined W9 form is applicable for the supplier. It could have been a W8 or it could have been any other country specific form. We also capture state withholding tax forms. The supplier can multi-select from a list of states. So in this case, we'll pick North Carolina and California. Now, California happens to have a state-specific withholding tax form. So additional questions are presented for California. Similarly, we'll present questions for Pennsylvania, Puerto Rico, and other states. Once these questions are answered, the system will determine whether the California specific withholding tax form is applicable or not. We support 590 for California, 587, and so on and so forth. And all of these data points can be auto-populated in those state level withholding tax forms. For IRS, we have some additional questions for the W-9, and this list is synchronized with IRS at all times, and the vendor can optionally pick these data points. And we'll see how it works very soon. The next screen is the banking screen. Over here, based on the payment method electronic, the supplier needs to enter at least one bank account. Again, we have bank rules configured for every single country in the world out of box. And this is what comprises of those 180,000 business rules. For the bank screen to work, it's important to know where the money is coming from, the paying location, and the supplier has an option to pick one or more addresses and tie it to this bank account. Or they could enter a separate bank account per address. We support that as well. The bank country is the United States by default, and you can see the ABA routing numbers and account numbers are required, with the SWIFT code being optional because it's a domestic payment. But if I were to change the country to say United Kingdom, you will notice the screen refreshes and now an IBAN number is required because UK happens to be an IBAN participant. Similarly, if we keep changing the bank country, you'll notice like if I change the bank country to say Mexico, then the Mexico specific routing number and account numbers will be required. In this case, it's CLAB A number and so on and so forth. And one more example I want to show all of you is the bank country of Japan. And the moment we select that, then the Zenjin code will appear because that's how the routing number is called in country of Japan. So as you can see, we have pre-configured rules for all countries in the world. We validate routing numbers for every single country in the world, along with SWIFT codes and IBANs. For US, once we enter the routing number, it will auto-populate the rest of the details like the SWIFT code, the bank name, address, and so on. We'll do it for all countries. But for US alone, we'll validate the account number with the ownership details in the bank account, right? So we'll know whether the account belongs to the name of the vendor or not. In addition to US, we'll do the same validation for account ownership for Sweden and India. And we are working on adding more and more countries in the near future. The next screen talks about insurance information. This can be made optional or page can be hidden based on the type of supplier we are working with. The next screen talks about capturing CEO name, CFO name, and so on. And we are also able to validate this data point with the prohibited list check, for example, to ensure you're in compliance with OFAC or 89 plus lists worldwide. We know that the supplier is a small business from our SmartVM database, so that has been auto-populated here with the certification number and the agency SBA.gov which certified this vendor as a small business. If the vendor has additional certifications they want to enter, they can use the add new certification option. And let's say select ethnicity as the certification type and then African American. And now the certification number, or they can put self-certified. So this way we are able to capture one or more minority codes or diversity codes, and ultimately you can do your spend reporting based on these data points. Once the certification information is captured, then we get to the document upload page. In this screen, you can see a variety of documents being required. One of them is California 590 form that we auto-generated. So the vendor does not have to type in this form manually or upload it. They can simply e-sign it after validating that the information on the form is correct. Very similar to the 590 form, we can e-sign the W9 form. And again, we auto-generate it and keep it up to date based on IRS regulations. And once the form looks good to the vendor, they can again, under penalties of perjury, agree to these terms and e-sign the form. The rest of the documentation can be ultimately uploaded by the supplier, as you can see here, and ultimately they can finish the registration. So using business rules, we can trigger one or more document requirements. So what you have seen so far is the invitation process, which was filled out by internal client user. Then you saw the vendor register through the registration module and what their experience looked like. And now we are going to switch users and talk about the approval queues and how those work. So if we look at the approval queues, we have a ready to approve queue based on the logged in user. And the way approval queues work is it's first in, first out. So uh, the vendor that I just registered with will be in the last page of the queue right now. So if I go to the last page and select the vendor United Spinal Association using which I registered, and I look at the vendor controls, it has a red X, meaning one or more validations failed. So what are these validations that we performed on the vendor? Address validation, you saw that in action as the supplier was registering in real time. Bank account validation, where the name on the account mismatches with the name of the vendor. Account ownership validation, where the name on the bank account, bank records do not match with the name of the vendor. So we do a three-way match on the bank account validation. The bank code, which is global, all routing numbers in the world are validated. Duplicate bank check, which is one or more vendor records, unique vendor records having the exact same bank account. So you would want to know about that before you approve the vendor. Same way, the duplicate vendor validation check, the email validation check. We perform tax ID validation for more than 56 countries worldwide. So that is stated here. And lastly, the prohibited list check, which is matching the vendor against OFAC lists and 89 different lists worldwide. So that's the end-to-end experience. A very quick preview of how our registration process solves the compliance requirements. And to Danny's point, how did one of our clients in 90 days implemented the registration module and were able to check off that box in terms of compliance. What's next after the screen is typically integration with your ERP systems, where once the record is approved, we can take this data point or data set and send it to your ERP in real time and get that vendor number back. A lot of our clients also opt for auto approvals. So if all validations pass, you don't have to do manual due diligence because you can rely upon these validations. So we also have an auto approval process in place. So having said that, Danny, do we have any questions that we need to address right now? You're on mute, Danny.
Thanks, Akhilesh. Yeah, lots of good questions coming in, which we'll address at the end. Some about China and Sweden and other things. A lot of interest around the bank account controls. We'll get to them. And everyone, please continue to send in your questions.
Perfect.
All right. So let's move on to scenario 2, just to make sure we get through the demos. So we've all been there, right? You've boarded your flight and you're on the plane and you're just sitting there. And then the pilot comes on over the loudspeaker. Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is your captain speaking. The maintenance crew has informed me a flight controller needs a bit of maintenance and they need a part from the warehouse. So everyone sit back, relax, and we'll get on our way as soon as possible. Okay, so that's frustrating enough, but now think about that after so many flights have been grounded over the last year. Think of the strain that's put on the spare parts suppliers, how many have gone out of business or at risk of going out of business, and how hard it is for the airlines to know about all of that associated with all of their suppliers. Well, one of the airlines came to us in the last year to help them address this problem. And they needed to understand which suppliers were weathering the storm, which ones were failing, and most importantly, where did they need to find a replacement or a backup supplier? And the good news is this client was able to map its supplier risk by deploying apexportal supplier risk management module, which combines highly configurable supplier questionnaires, a bunch of them pre-built out of the box, but you can configure them as you need. Third-party risk data is fed into the solution, as well as AI-enabled news monitoring. And a key piece for this client was having suppliers complete questionnaires about their business continuity plans and their financial status. So that's what Akhilesh is going to show. Again, he will demonstrate 3 roles. Not every supplier requires the same sort of monitoring. So he'll start by demonstrating how to configure a supplier segment and a questionnaire for that segment. And then he'll switch to the supplier experience, completing the questionnaire. And then a third role, a risk analyst, reviewing the supplier scorecard, including the questionnaire results. Okay, so Akhilesh, go ahead.
Thank you, Danny. So in this demo, we are going to see how risk module works, and especially the questionnaires feature. To make the questionnaires work, we are going to go into the risk management portion of the application and start by segmenting the supplier. So with segmentation, we are targeting a set of suppliers for the questionnaires because you don't want all of the questionnaires to be sent to all of your suppliers. So you're seeing a preview of direct suppliers, IT suppliers, or suppliers targeted for a particular questionnaire. And you're able to change these segmentations based on different criteria. So if you look at the direct supply criteria, it's based on electronic vendors in that vendor industry, right? But I have an option to add any other criteria like the country of the supplier, the vendor number, and so on and so forth. Once the segmentation is done, then we tie that segmentation to a particular questionnaire. And in this case, you can see the ethics questionnaire in the screen. And one more thing about the ethics questionnaire is the ability to configure different thresholds from a client perspective, because not everyone evaluates risk in the same manner. So typically when we create a scorecard for risk, it's between 0 to 100, 100 being the highest amount of risk. So if you have different thresholds in your company where you want the high risk to be, let's say, greater than equal to 70 versus greater than equal to 80 or default, you're able to do that in this screen. And same way, you can define different color codings for high, medium, and low risk. So that's how this screen works in terms of the assessment. The next thing is the strategy, where we can tie the marketing campaign of the risk questionnaires to different strategies. And over here, you can see that the ethics strategy is not only enabled at the time of registration, which we will see next, but also it can get triggered on a semi-annual basis so that you don't have to remind yourself to reach out to the supplier and ask them the ethics questionnaire again. The system will do the reminders for you and send out emails asking the supplier to review the answers again and make sure they're in compliance. Similarly, for every questionnaire that you see on the screen, different intervals can be configured, like yearly IT strategy or yearly BCP strategy, and so on and so forth. Now let's take a look at the supplier's view. Once the supplier is logged in, they get to this ethics questionnaire screen. And over here, you can see a sample ethics questionnaire, which is configured out of box. And there are many other questionnaires that you get as an out of box configuration. So on the ethics questionnaire, you can see a number of questions that Apex has configured. Each of these questions can have their own weightage, and every answer can have a different scorecard tied to them. So all of this is configurable. Out of box, we have assigned some default weightages and scoring for every answer, but you have full control over them. So during any implementation, we'll work with you on configuring the weightage based on what's most important to your company. So as you can see on the ethics questionnaire, there are a number of questions. In the demo system, we have kept most of the questions optional, but in a real life situation, we'll make them as required. So similar to ethics, we have other questionnaires that are configured in the system. One of them happens to be finance or BCP and IT questionnaire. So what we're going to do is take a look at them one by one. So this is the finance questionnaire, and you can see some out-of-box configuration on what's the financials of the vendor. BCP questionnaire, a long list of questions on business continuity, and especially with the pandemic in place today, right? And you want to be really careful about the due diligence you're doing on your suppliers. IT questionnaire targeted towards your software vendors or IT suppliers to make sure they're complying with these questions. For example, do they support single sign-on to mitigate fraud risk? Or do they have a backup recovery process, and so on and so forth. Once the suppliers entered all of the answers, as an administrator, as an approver, you can review the vendor controls. So this is a different view. Over here, you're seeing a lot of vendor controls from the registration, but also some new scores which are related to those questionnaires. So if we drill down on the risk scorecard, now you get to this screen, which is showing the risk score for every question and every questionnaire the supplier answered. So there's a scorecard on ethics questionnaire. There's a scorecard on IT questionnaire. There's a scorecard on BCP, and ultimately finance. You will notice that some of these questions are meeting expectations, and others are below expectations in red. So what this means is we are using the answers to automatically determine whether it meets your expectation or not based on the previously configured thresholds. And then we are giving a scorecard for risk for every answer. You're seeing on the screen that there's total points possible. By default, it's 1. So same weightage for every question. And then depending on the type of answers, whether it's yes, no, or multiple choice, you get the corresponding scores. But all of this is configurable, and we can increase or decrease total points possible and the individual weightage of each answer in the score. So that's a preview of how our risk questionnaires work, how we can reach out to suppliers at different intervals and make sure they are in compliance on a constant basis, and how we create the scorecard, which can be retrofitted in your approval process to make sure you're doing all due diligence, both from a registration perspective as well as risk perspective before approving the supplier. We have a lot more features on risk. So for example, we support news-based scorecards with over 300,000 news channels or news sites monitored for suppliers. We have a fraud detect risk module, which measures supplier risk on vendor characteristics, vendor employee matches, or even the invoice characteristics. So, and then we have third-party risk assessments, like with connections to DNB, LexisNexis, and so on. So it's a very comprehensive module, and we'll be talking more about the in-depth coverage of our risk module in future demo sessions.
Great. Thanks, Akhilesh. Continue to get some great questions coming in. We'll get to in a minute. So scenario 3, while some industries like the airlines were severely disrupted, others were experiencing a huge surge in activity. And one of those industries was healthcare. Healthcare providers and all of their suppliers had to rise up to do more than ever in the last year, and they continue to do so. And to feed their supply chains, their suppliers needed more working capital, more than they had on hand. And so getting paid even 30 days earlier could make a real difference to those suppliers. But our clients, the healthcare providers, they couldn't really afford to pay everyone early without some sort of benefit because they needed cash too. So in the summer of 2020, our healthcare client was able to quickly address this need. What was great for them was that they already had our supplier portal in place to support 100% of their suppliers. Suppliers were already going to the central hub to not only manage their master data, but they were using it to monitor their invoices and payments and when things were going to get paid. So that provided this perfect platform for our client to offer early payments to suppliers in exchange for a small discount. And to do it electronically made it scalable in the short term. So what made that program work was two things. One was built-in predictive analytics provided by Apex that helped target early payment offers to the suppliers who looked like they needed it most, and a super flexible communications engine that let suppliers evaluate and accept offers in the way that worked best for them. And to demonstrate this solution called Accelerate Cash or dynamic discounting, Akhilesh is going to show you first how easy it is to set up the program using our AI predictive analytics, what we call the cash discount likelihood scores. And then 3 different ways we make it easy for suppliers to take advantage of the early payment opportunities. Akhilesh?
Thank you, Danny. So moving on with a preview of how our cash management module works. So we're going to start with the segmentation of suppliers. And by segmentation, we can determine how many suppliers are eligible for the dynamic discounting or supply chain features, and we can target towards those. So over here in the segmentation screen, you can see a demo segment called all US suppliers with a given number of vendors and total invoice amount. As we go through the segmentation exercise, there are a variety of criteria that we can use to configure the segmentation. One of them happens to be a cash discount likelihood score or CDL score. So the CDL score is a proprietary score created by Apex, and we are able to predict how likely the supplier will offer a discount and accept an early payment from the client. And we can do this prediction for all of your suppliers worldwide. Once we know what the cash discount likelihood score is, it is then very easy to segment the suppliers based on that likelihood score and target specific offers to those suppliers. The CDL score, because it's predicting how likely the supplier will accept an early payment, so the higher the likelihood, the more APR or discount you could get from them. So that's a practical use case. If the CDL score is low and you have sufficient cash flow, you could target different offers to those suppliers with a lower CDL score and encourage them to accept early payments as well. So that's how we can use CDL score by segmenting different suppliers. But we are not limited to CDL scores only. Using the segmentation screen, we can segment based on either specific vendor numbers, past spend over 180 days, how frequently the supplier is logging into the system and checking the status of the invoice. So if they're showing some urgency around getting the payment, we can even use that in our predictive logic and segment suppliers based on that, right? And similarly, you can see other criteria on the screen, which is, has the supplier taken a discount or taken an early payment before and offered discounts, whether it's with you or in the industry in general, right? Or the supplier belongs to a specific industry, which is typically taking early payments and offering discounts. So we have a number of criteria to configure the segmentation to your advantage. So once the segmentation of the suppliers is done, then we move on to the next step, which is the offer screen. So in the offer screen, we have, again, a variety of options to target suppliers based on specific offers. So in this offer is created with a APR of 18%, and we'll use a sliding scale to lower the APR as we get nearer to the payment due date of the supplier. So all of that work is done dynamically, and that's why we call it dynamic discounting. So other than the APR, we can also configure on the screen immediate cash option, meaning will the supplier offer additional discount into lieu of a wire payment, for example, or do we want to enable supply chain financing, which is instead of using your own money and cash flow to fund the dynamic discounting, you can use supply chain financing to use the bank's money or a financial institution's money to fund the early payments, in which case the supplier gets paid early and you end up paying the financial institution at a later date. So you can configure supply chain financing to be turned on. And when you turn it on, for example, you can also pick a lender. So you can have different segmentations with different offers. In offer one, you could use bank number one. In offer two, you could use bank number two. And you're seeing some examples on the screen on how we can use different banks with the supply chain financing option. So once the offers have been created, we move on to the strategy. And in the strategy screen, it's very important to configure the marketing of these offers. So unless we tell the supplier that there is an offer to take early payments, they may not be aware, and therefore they may not be able to take advantage of it. So the discount marketing screen helps us market the strategy or email. So email is just one of the options, and there are other options for suppliers to accept early payments. Now, in terms of emails, there is a execution frequency. The most commonly used execution frequency in a production environment is either a daily campaign, which markets open invoices to your suppliers for early payment, or there is a weekly campaign, which is frequently used. So between daily or weekly, we can market to the suppliers. There are additional options like annually, monthly, quarterly, and so on. And you can pick what meets the best for your use case. So once the marketing campaign has started, the supplier will get an email from the system, which is this email message. The supplier can open this email message. So we have switched the experience. You're now looking at the supplier's mailbox. And in this email, we have the name of the supplier, the payment amount, discount amount, total invoice amount. So the supplier is aware of the early payments and what they can take advantage of. And then at the bottom of the email, you can see the listing of all open invoices and the discounts calculated on each invoice based on the due date and the payment term. So you can see for some invoices, the discount percentages are varying. At this time, the supplier can click on accept offer to directly take the early payment and offer the discount, or always accelerate cash, which means enroll me in this process for future, always pay me early, and always capture the maximum discount possible on the invoice. With this always accelerate cash, the enrollment becomes high, and therefore you can maximize on the discounts. There are two other ways on capturing early payments. So the second way is by specific invoice numbers. So if the supplier doesn't want to accelerate payment on all invoices, they can log in. This is the supplier's dashboard. I can pick and choose specific invoices here. So for example, I'll pick the first two invoices on the screen and then request early payment through Accelerate Cash. I get a pop-up screen, shows me today's date, and then the APR, which is calculated based on today's date and the due date and the payment terms of the invoice. So the weighted discount rate of 1.78%. If I select a future date, the discount rate changes to 1.63%. So as we get nearer to the due date, the discount will reduce. So the supplier has an option to pick their date and get the early payment from the system. The last way is by goal. And over here, the supplier can simply set a goal like $500,000 in early payment, and the system will automatically find the eligible invoices and allow the supplier to take an early payment, right? So instead of trying to select specific invoices to figure out whether I'm meeting my goal or not, this is a very quick and easy way to get early payments just by entering a dollar amount and find the matching invoices automatically. So those are the three different ways: by email, by specific invoice numbers, and by goal. And the supplier always has an option to enroll in always accelerate cash so that in future they don't have to take any manual action. So that's what I wanted to cover in this preview. And over to you, Danny.
Thanks, Akhilesh. So that's the end of the demo portion. It's been amazing just to see how everything works, Akhilesh. Now's the time for everybody on the call to raise any questions you may have in the WebEx chat box. And while you're raising your questions, I'll just take a second to tell you about something we're really proud of, and that is the Spend Matter solution map for supplier relationship management and risk. And if you're not familiar with the Spend Matter solution map, it is the result of an exhaustive RFI, demo, customer survey, and customer interview process where experts from Spend Matters review and rate all of the solutions in the market and map capabilities on this chart. The y-axis on the left reflects the analyst ratings, and probably as important, maybe more important, is the x-axis, which reflects the customer's ratings. What do the customers experience with the solutions? And combine these ratings to the top and the right of the rest of the field is where apexanalytix is landing. We're just excited about that. And Spend Matters attributes our success here to three things: best-in-class data validation capabilities, workflow configuration and business rules engine, and top performing risk modeling and monitoring capabilities. And they recommend that you consider this solution even if you have another P2P automation solution in place. So with that, thank you for your questions so far. And just getting to some of the questions, Akhilesh, what about China? What sorts of validations do we have in place for suppliers in China?
That's a great question. So for China, first of all, we do the address validation because it's global, so China is included in it. The supplier can enter their addresses in local Chinese characters, for example, or they can enter it in English and we validate both. We can also transliterate from Chinese to English specific to address validation. The next validation we do for China is the bank master validation. So China has specific routing numbers for banks in China, and we are able to validate all of the routing numbers for China as well, including any SWIFT code associated with those banks in China. So that's the second level validation. And the third is just in terms of document capture, if there's specific business processes requiring documents from vendors in China, the system is configured to request those documents as well. So those are the three sets of China specific validations. Now, in terms of business rules for China, it comes pre-configured. So we do capture tax information for China, address, bank information, and so on and so forth.
Similar question for Denmark or Sweden. Do you have any specific examples of what we're doing for Denmark or Sweden?
Yes, for sure. So Denmark and Sweden, first of all, are covered in our tax validations for those 56 plus countries. So for Denmark and Sweden, if there's a VAT number or a local tax ID number, we will validate it through our system. Address validation is covered for those two countries. Bank master validation is covered for those countries. Specific to Sweden, we go one step further in the bank account validation. So in Sweden, if you're using the bank gyro payment method to make payments locally to your suppliers, we validate the bank gyro numbers, and we also make sure it belongs to the name of the supplier. So that's what is covered for Sweden and Denmark.
Great. A couple of other questions about bank validation. So when we're doing the banking account validation with the countries where we're doing ownership validation, there's a validation of the legal name on the supplier to the legal name on the bank account. What are there any other things that we're checking there? Could you just run through those again?
Sure. So the first one is the bank master. So routing number is validated, and using the routing number, we can auto-populate SWIFT code and IBANs and so on and so forth. The next step is if the routing number was not entered, then SWIFT code is validated as it is entered, and using that, we can do a reverse auto population on routing and IBAN. Third is IBAN itself. We validate that for all countries. Then the next step and the last step in banking validation is the account number. So for 3 countries in the world, India, Sweden, and USA, we validate account numbers. We also match it with the name of the vendor. And if there is a mismatch found, we'll flag it for the vendor controls. We don't stop there. We take this name validation one step further, and then we incorporate the tax ID match, the address match, and the business entity type. Are you a corporation or an individual, with the bank records too? Because it's just not about the name match on the bank account. For example, more than one individual could have the same name on the bank account. So it is very important to add the tax ID, the address of the vendor, and the business entity type to the bank account name match validation as well.
Great. So around bank account validation, of course, the portal has bank account validation in place, but we talked about Smart VM and the Smart VM API. And one person asked, is it possible to purchase only the bank account validation? Maybe I don't need everything else, or I have a solution that's covering everything else. What if I just want the bank account validation?
Sure. So there are 2 ways you can take advantage of the bank validation. One is obviously through the portal, and there's also a simplified version of the portal called a proxy portal that you can use at your own convenience without exposing or launching the portal to all your suppliers. So you can use the registration for internal use. But on top of that, you can subscribe to our Smart VM APIs. And the Smart VM APIs offer microservices from a technical standpoint. So what are microservices? It means that you can access any one or more of our validations on an individual basis and take advantage of those validations. So if you subscribe to our Smart VM APIs and integrate it with a platform of your choice, yes, you can take advantage of individual validations.
Great. So you could have the full-blown supplier-facing supplier registration process. You could have an internally only facing one where either somebody in the field or somebody on the maintenance team enters the supplier data into the form and it gets validated. And you can limit that to only the specific fields that you care about if you prefer. And then you could also just subscribe to the Smart VM solution that would only do the bank account validation. And you could integrate that into any system you want. I mean, it would do the bank account validation if that's what you wanted. It could do any of the other validations that someone might want, and they could integrate that into any system they want.
That's right.
All right, another question. We have 2 payment systems. One is our ERP, Oracle Fusion. The other is a custom medical claims payment system. So we have suppliers in both systems. How could Apex be configured to update 2 different systems?
That's a great question. And we have a number of clients using multiple ERP systems. So your use case fits right into that scenario where we integrate with more than one system. So how the supplier's experience is going to be is when you onboard a new supplier, for example, we'll capture the supplier details one time. The suppliers will only have one login credential. But when they register, we'll associate the supplier's profile with more than one legal entity or company code or the ERP identifier, depending on the config. And what that tells our system is that when the vendor record is approved, take that same vendor data and go connect to one or more ERP systems or your internal systems and update the same data set. So we have this functionality out of box. We can do the reverse as well. So think about launching the system day one. We'll take all your data from each system, the Oracle Fusion ERP and your internal system. We'll bring in all your vendors from both systems to the Apex portal. We'll do a duplicate check using Smart VM, and the potential duplicates can be merged into a single profile in Apex, and then we launch the portal. So which means going forward, when your suppliers are trying to update their bank information, for example, they do it one time, and then we update both systems simultaneously the moment you approve the record.
I'll put you on the spot, Akhilesh. What's the highest number of systems that any of our clients have integrated with a single Apex portal?
So I'll give the answer in two ways. One is number of ERP systems live in production as of date. So we have integrated with at least 3 ERP systems in production, simultaneous integration. But we have clients today during implementation where we are working with almost 60 ERP systems, and that is scheduled to go live later this year.
That's awesome. So you talked about Smart VM and pre-populating the supplier record with Apex's golden record for the supplier. What if the vendor is not in Smart VM? What happens then for the supplier?
Great question. So even if a match is not found in the Smart VM database among those 40 million supplier records, we are still able to validate all of the supplier data points, right? So tax IDs, address, bank master, and so on and so forth. And then once that validation is done, we create a new version of that golden record in Smart VM for going forward. Now, assume that that same supplier then further tries to register with 3 other Apex portal instances and 3 other Apex clients. Now we have a validated information that we can use for future, right? Now, if that supplier updates their address in another Apex portal instance, you get to take advantage of that too. So we will send you an alert with that updated supplier record, and you can choose to either accept or reject those changes, or even tell the supplier to log into their profile and keep their record up to date. So with the golden record creation process, which is 24/7 real time as we speak, we will ultimately end up creating a golden record for that.
Yeah, I know that there are a couple of other things, with the point being you want to make it as easy as possible for their supplier. There's some things that you've shown where, like, if the supplier enters in an address that isn't exactly right, it gets automatically corrected. The extended zip code may be added in. When they enter in the bank routing number, all of the bank details get pre-populated. So any place along the way we can save the supplier some data entry points that happens. Forms get created automatically,
right.
etc.
And you're right, Danny. Another way to say it is we validate 100% of your suppliers through different data points, and we can enrich additional data points if we find a golden record match.
Great. So we've got one more question, but before, I think we have time to get to one more question, but before I do that, we have a poll that we want to throw up. And really, this is just an opportunity for anybody on the call to request more information about any of the solutions that we've talked about today. So just if you want us to get in touch with some more information, just respond to the poll. You can ask for information about more than one. All right. And then I had one last question. Oh, yeah. And you touched on this a little bit. So we talked about multiple ERPs. What if a supplier has multiple bank accounts? They're supporting they need to be paid in different circumstances to 4 different bank accounts. How would you manage that?
Sure. In a banking screen, the supplier is first of all able to add multiple bank accounts. They can put different currency codes for each bank account. And then they can also tie or link each bank account to different remit addresses, for example, or different paying locations where the money is coming from. So if the vendor wants to use a bank in UK, when you're making payment out of the UK legal entity, that is possible. And the same way, if the bank is in US, and that has to be linked to a legal entity which is making payment from USA, that is also possible, right? So our banking screen is very comprehensive in terms of linking with where the money is coming from, where the remit address of the vendor is, and specifically currency codes.
That's great. Well, we've hit the top of the hour. Akhilesh, thank you so much for your time demonstrating the solution that you and your team have put together. It really just reflects a lot of experience that you've had solving problems with clients, and it's really cool that it everything you've learned along the way just immediately becomes available to the next company that needs to deploy the solution. And then there's a lot of configurability to address whatever the new situations they may raise. Again, for everyone on the call, it's been a real pleasure sharing this information with you. If you want any more information, just let us know through the Q&A or go to our website. We'd be happy to share anything else that you would like to know about or put you in touch with other clients. Depending on how the response to this goes, we'll do more of these demos in the future, sort of a different kind of webinar for us. But it's been fun so far. So thank you very much. And I think we'll be making this video either in whole or maybe different segments of it available on our website and other places in the future if you want to see them again. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you all.